Hello and welcome to Clock Strikes Midnight. In this episode, we're cutting into the wrath of Bloody Bill Anderson. Come along as we head to Centralia, Missouri, site of Bill's bloodiest killing fields, in an attempt to get to the bottom of his rage. Prepare for a journey into the dark.
Mutilations, public executions, mass murder, and guerrilla warfare, right here in mid-Missouri, or Missouri as some might say. These are some of the terms used when describing Bloody Bill Anderson, Confederate guerrilla, madman, and Missouri native. Destroying property, burning buildings, and assaulting, raping, and murdering innocent victims, Bloody Bill, who died at age 24, was perhaps the most lethal and savage product of the American Civil War, and arguably one of the most brutal figures in American history. Not only sharing common first names with the man at the center of last week's mystery, William T. Baird, William T. Anderson, or Bloody Bill as he would come to be known, also migrated from Kentucky to Missouri. The Anderson family would settle in Huntsville, Missouri, while Bill was still a young schoolboy. The family would eventually move to Kansas when Bill was a teenager, and it was around this time that he got into horse trading, which would eventually lead to horse stealing and thievery. It's unclear what set Bill Anderson off on his path of evil. Perhaps a culmination of unfortunate happenings throughout Bill's short life led him to ruthless aggression. After all, in 1860, Bill's mother died after being struck by lightning. In 1862, Bloody Bill's father was killed in a dispute over stolen horses. Their family farm burned and looted by the time Bill was able to find his father slain. What's more, in 1863, one of Bill's sisters was killed and the other badly maimed when Union soldiers caused the collapse of a makeshift jail where Anderson's sisters, Confederate sympathizers, were being held. Bill became accustomed to killing at an early age, shooting and killing a member of the Kaw tribe in the 1850s. Bill spent the latter half of 1862 tracking down and killing the judge whom he blamed for his father's death. After trapping the judge inside of the basement of his house, Bill burned the man alive. Following the murder of the judge, Bloody Bill returned to central and northern Missouri, joining the Confederate cause, hooking up with William Quantrill. Bloody Bill led his own band of guerrillas, a smaller sect of Quantrill's raiders. Bill's gang included the likes of the notorious mutilator, Archie Clement, and legendary outlaws, the James brothers, Frank and Jesse James. Riding throughout central Missouri from 1862 through 1864, Bloody Bill and his band of guerrilla soldiers wreaked havoc on small towns and settlements, many times regardless of the victims' political commitments. Though his family was largely in support of the Confederacy, Bill was notorious for stating that he was only in the business of war and killing for the purpose of making money. Quoted once saying to Union troops, "I don't care any more than you for the South, but there sure is a lot of money in this business." Bloody Bill was once reprimanded by Confederate superiors for robbing and terrorizing Confederate sympathizers. It seems that Bill's only loyalty was to himself. In 1863, Bloody Bill led his guerrilla warfighters at the Lawrence Massacre, a brutal attack on the pro-Union town of Lawrence, Kansas. This slaughter left over 140 dead, only 40 of them actually Union troops. Many of those killed were regular townsfolk caught in the crossfire. During the massacre, many young boys were made to surrender publicly before being executed in front of their families. Anderson's crew collected the most kills. Bill himself killed 14 people. Making his way back to Missouri in 1864, Bloody Bill was quickly gaining a reputation as one of the most savage and feared guerrilla leaders fighting for the Confederacy. His band of ruffians gained the nickname of Incarnate Fiends, and Anderson himself was called the Devil by some. By September, the battle-hardened Bloody Bill and his gang found themselves in Centralia, Missouri. On September 27th, Bill's gang would create a blockade and stop a train carrying 23 Union troops. After clearing the train of the troops and stripping them naked of their uniforms, Bill had the soldiers lined up, where he read his twisted version of their last rites. "I will show you that I can kill men with as much skill and rapidity as anybody. From this time on, I ask no quarter and give none." He then publicly executed 22 of the 23 soldiers just outside of the Centralia train depot. The soldiers were shot to death and then scalped and mutilated afterwards. The remaining soldier was taken hostage but eventually escaped. Anderson's gang would rob the civilians on the train and then set it ablaze, sending it back on its way down the tracks toward the town of Sturgeon. A plaque marker stands where the massacre took place. Later in the day, Anderson and his band of guerrilla warfighters left Centralia and headed back to their camp, shortly thereafter being pursued by the 39th Missouri Volunteer Infantry, who were armed with single-shot rifles. Bill and each member of his gang had multiple revolvers. When Bill found out he was being pursued, he proceeded to set a trap that would lead over 123 Union soldiers to their brutal deaths. Bill would lead the gullible volunteer army over a hill and into a field towards his camp, leaving them surrounded by woods on 3 sides. Bill had his troops flood the woods, waiting until the Union troops were too far into the field to turn back. He then ambushed the Union troops, who thought they were chasing a much smaller force, overwhelming them and demolishing their cause that day. Union soldiers are said to have been chopped into pieces, gutted with their entrails removed. Their bodies were supposedly desecrated and stuffed with dead and rotting cattle from a nearby farm. One victim is said to have had his penis cut off and shoved in his mouth. Bill and his army shot, scalped, tortured, maimed, and killed 123 plus that day. A massive loss of life at the hands of brutal savagery, all in one place, in a short amount of time. If a place can be tainted by such events, like residual haunting theories suggest, this place is certain to be cursed. Bill is said to have collected the scalps of his victims. Some say he carried them around on his person as a display of triumph. Other tales say that Bloody Bill wore a knotted rope as part of his regalia, one knot for each man that he had killed. When word of the events from Centralia reached the Union command, they decided it was time to pursue Anderson more heavily. This time, those chasing the war-born savage would be armed with artillery. Anderson left town later that same day, September 27th. He and his troops paring down into smaller factions while on the run to avoid capture. After Centralia, Bloody Bill joined up with Confederate General Sterling Price's army before his infamous attack on Glasgow, Missouri. It was in Glasgow that Bill would severely beat and torture Benjamin Lewis, who would later die of his injuries. Bill and his gang also raped Lewis's underage servant, who was just 13 years old at the time. It was shortly after this that Bill was tracked down by Union Lieutenant Samuel P. Cox and his group of 150 men. It was in Oren, Missouri, on October 26, 1864, when Bloody Bill and his men faced off with Cox's army. When Bill and his gang recklessly charged Cox's Union line, he was shot and killed, just 24 years young. Much like Bill mutilated the dead around him, it is said that Bill's corpse was paraded through town, his head cut off and staked in the town square. A gruesome display of Union victory. The head of a literal boogeyman, cut off of his dead body for all to see. Bloody Bill's vicious ways would mark him down in history as one of the most savage and brutal products of the American Civil War. Stories of Bloody Bill's evil ways frightened even the most hardened war generals when they heard of him. The tales of his brutality still resonate today as they did over 150 years ago. For generations, parents told their children ghost stories of Bloody Bill, warning those who chose to stay out too late or sneak out at night could potentially fall victim to the ghost of Bloody Bill Anderson. In fact, myself and members of our team have a Bloody Bill ghost story of our own.
So about 12 years ago, me and Eric did some exploring around Rennick, and we were into Bloody Bill Anderson, Civil War legend. He did a lot of, he camped out around Centralia, Rennick, and places like that. So me and Eric took his camcorder and went out to the graveyard behind my dad's place. That's about a mile south of Rennick, and then from my house, it's about a mile west in the woods. And we had done research that Bloody Bill had camped down around a creek, and there was a bluff coming up from the creek. And we had found what we thought that was that same place. And up from there, from the bluff, was where the graveyard was. So we did a little recording down around the creek, and once we started heading up the bluff, we were recording and then come up on the graveyard and recorded the tombstones, think sort of like a documentary, a makeshift documentary, and went through the graveyard and then exited out of the woods. And once we came back and got to Eric's house, we went to review the footage and come to find out that the footage wasn't there. As we were heading up the hill, it was recording just fine, and then it cut out, and the only time it records anymore is as we're leaving the woods too. So, and both of us had the camera at different times throughout the graveyard and stuff, and I remember the recording light being on, so it's definitely some weird stuff.
A strange experience, to say the least. We also made investigation trips to the Centralia massacre site, the Centralia battlefield, and the temporary burial site of those massacred at the battle. The massacre site and the temporary burial of those killed in the battle both produced high levels of EMF, which are likely caused by the telephone poles, power stations, transformers, and railroad tracks in the direct vicinity. Outside of town, at the battlefield, people report seeing ghostly orbs and mists. Other reports say that if you go to the battlefield at night, you can hear the sounds of gunfire and the screams of dying soldiers being mutilated. When we went, we heard the sounds of branches falling in the woods and cows mooing from nearby pastures. It's not out of the realm of possibility to suggest that the falling branches could be construed as gunfire and the cattle sounds interpreted as screams. Maybe, though, it's the residual spirits of the killing field, the souls of the dead left to replay the horrific scene of their demise over and over.
Questions remain. Do places where brutal events and mass losses of life occur become haunted because of it? And can the savagery of a man outweigh the savagery of war? The answers are out there. How far are you willing to go to find them?